Okay, this video is going to focus a little bit on the impact of the news media on government and politics. So, if you look at this chart, one of the first things to acknowledge, right, or to identify is that where people get their news from today very much differs according to like generation, right? Like, no surprise, younger generations tend to get their information more from social media, whereas older generations tend to get them from more like traditional news sources like newspapers, right? Things like that, right? Even if you look at reliance on like TV is not really used by young people very much compared to like older generations, right? So there is this generational divide in where we get our news coverage from. And obviously today, because of the internet, because of podcasts, because of cable TV, there are so many more news choices today than there used to be. All right. So most of this is going to focus on how the media can really influence politics and government. So the first role that the media can serve at in terms of like doing is they can engage in what's called framing. So framing is just the way in which the media decides to present a story and the impact that that can have on influencing public opinion. And obviously, politicians need to care about public opinion, right? Because ultimately they want to get reelected. So the media has a lot of sway in determining how the public looks at issues. Like, for example, right, if you look at like a conflict like the war on terrorism, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan between like, the early 2000s up through just a couple years ago, these were the images that you would see on TV a lot, right? Images of sort of the aftermath of attacks on like American soldiers, and seeing those images over and over and over again could be instrumental in sort of like swinging public opinion against the war. But like these weren't images that were like frequently seen. And not to say that like everything that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was positive, but the media tends to focus more on the negative. So the average individual thinks like what's going on there is mostly negative. So based on the images they choose to show you, that can basically influence your public opinion about an issue. The other role that the media serves as is what we call the gatekeeper or agenda setting function. So, the definition of this function for the media is that the news sources ultimately determine what subjects are important and for how long based on their decision to cover the issue. Americans are prone to think that if the media is covering something, it's important. And if they're not covering something, it's not important. It's the media that's setting the agenda. So, for example, these blue dots on this screen represent areas that were mentioned at least 5 times on U.S. nightly news broadcasts between 2012 and 2022. Right. So every dot it was mentioned 5 times on the major U.S. networks. You can see that it's mostly focused on America and then Europe. There's very little focused on places like Africa. So again, the average American is then predispositioned to think that like whatever's happening in Africa is just not important. And think about the impact that that has. Let's say there is a civil war in Africa or a genocide or a natural disaster. Americans are naturally going to be less interested in helping because they don't know very much about what's going on in these areas. So that's another really influential function that the media serves as like the agenda setter. We talked about horse race journalism a little bit when we talked about polling. This is another thing that media has been responsible for, that there's definitely been over the last decade or so less focus on policy differences, less discussion of issues, and a lot just more focus on campaign strategy and polls. Almost like treating politics like it's a sporting event. Constant focuses on elections and who's winning and who's predicted to win, because Americans love sports. And this is taking politics and turning it into sports, almost like it's a horse race. Like, this horse is racing against another one. Who's going to win? Let's describe the actual sport of it. That's kind of what the media has become as well. All right. I'm not going to play the clips for you, but another sort of trend going on with media coverage is that of like infotainment, right? That the media is no longer just about educating you, like informing you. They feel like they have to entertain you. And this has become like the era of like the hot take, right? It started with sports where you put two people on a screen and they yell back and forth at each other. And like that's kind of what goes on like Fox and CNN now. You have a Democrat and a Republican shout at each other, and that's like news now, right? It's more about drawing you in with the fight than it is like actually like educating you. Right. Again, so the term for this is infotainment. You're not really educating somebody, you're just entertaining them. There's like a blurred line now between entertaining you and trying to educate you. And then the last one is the idea of media sources now that narrowcast and that they're responsible for like bias. So news sources now cater to like very specific audiences. If you watch CNN, you're gonna get more of a liberal view. If you tune into Fox News, you're gonna get more of a conservative view. We're not broadcasting anymore, right? We're not broadcasting to the masses. We know which people, right, what ideology watches our program, and now we're going to basically just tailor the message to that group, right? So media bias is a very big thing, right? We can skip these, right? And most Americans now think that media bias is one of the biggest problems in U.S. campaigns. Like, how can we trust media outlets anymore? We just feel like they're biased against our particular like candidate. And again, that causes big problems because Americans have a hard time knowing who to trust, right? So again, these are just some of the basic influencing factors of media today. And obviously, we know that media is really crucial in shaping public opinion, influencing what Americans care about and how long they care about those issues.